Okay, hello everyone, welcome. My name is Kenneth Paul Tan and I'm very excited to facilitate this webinar, which is organized by HealthServe. In these past couple of months, we've absorbed a lot of news about what's going on in the dormitories. We've watched webinars like this one, and we've read various commentaries by experts in different fields, deliberating, sometimes even pontificating about the medical and public health aspects, the economic aspects, the sociological aspects, the technological aspects, the design and architectural aspects, the political and governance aspects, the geopolitical aspects, and the ethical, philosophical aspects of what is clearly a multifaceted, multi-perspective, wicked problem, or at least a problem with no straightforward solutions. We might even have heard bits and pieces of first-hand accounts, and those are certainly important. Not to confuse things further, but to help us see in practical detail the many parts of this problem and to challenge ourselves to work towards solutions that are not just technocratic, top-down, and one-dimensional, but also transformative, community building, and sustainable. Solutions that we would not be ashamed of when future historians write about us. Now, two sets of voices need to be firmly included in this conversation. First, of course, the migrant workers themselves. Let us not objectify them as helpless victims, but give them the agency to help us understand the problems and work with us to come up with solutions. And second are the migrant worker activists who help to advance their cause and to represent them when they are not able to speak for themselves. I hope we will have an opportunity to hear the migrant worker voices soon, but for today, we are very, very privileged to have leaders of 5 migrant worker organizations to share a particularly useful vantage point. That is to say, the view from the trenches. You will already have read their bios in the posters that we circulated earlier. We have very many questions for them, including a long list of questions that you, the audience, submitted earlier. We've tried to group them into themes and will attempt to address these themes. You are also very welcome to submit new questions during the webinar, which we will try our best to answer. And if we can't, we apologize in advance. So to begin, I would like to ask each panelist in turn to tell us up to 3 things that they think we, the audience, must know about their organization. So let's begin with Michael.
Oh, thank you, Kenneth. And thank you for this, and happy to be here. So let me introduce a little bit about HealthServe. HealthServe was founded in 2006, actually, and we started our very first clinic in Geylang in 2007 to provide medical care for the workers. And in our conversations with them and interactions with the workers, we realized that there were a host of other issues that the workers need, and such as work injuries, salary disputes, and therefore, after that, soon after, we immediately started our casework and social assistance as well. So HealthServe actually started to grow from there, and we have since grown to 3 medical centers, 3 dental centers, 2 casework centers as well. And HealthServe recently did a survey in 2018, and we did a check and see what are the things that seems to be lacking as well in the midst of all the migrant worker needs. And we also come to realize that there's a lot of stress that the workers go through, and therefore we actually developed a comprehensive mental health and a counseling program for the workers. We actually did a lot of mental wellness talk actually and work sites. We actually conducted a lot of focus groups on, and actually now we are actually hosting a lot of individual counseling as well with the workers. And yeah, HealthServe has been around working with the migrant workers and really wanting to meet their needs. And our mission is really to bring healing, inspire hope, and to bridge communities for the migrant workers. So back to you, Kenneth.
Thank you very much for sharing that, Michael. Let's move on to Catherine.
Thanks, Kenneth, and hi, everyone. Good to see friends here. Um, about home, home has been around for 15 years in the migrant worker space. We started very humbly and to what we are doing now, which is providing to be as comprehensive in our approach. We provide services to those who are falling through the gaps, both domestic workers and the non-domestic workers. Be it case management support to individual migrant workers for their salary issues, or if they have work injury cases, looking after well-being. We have a shelter for domestic workers who we provide assistance to, so those who are in distress, look after their well-being. We are also into building capacity and the confidence of workers and the knowledge of migrant workers, especially domestic workers, through our home academy courses, which is not just capacity building, but also creating a community of workers and for peer support. And lastly, but very importantly, we do advocacy work to push for more structural and upstream change. I would like to share something that I think is what I find special to home. And I'm still new at home, but this is something that really strikes out, is how we involve migrant worker community in the programs. And they form a bulk of our volunteers and help us to run our program, especially on the domestic side, in the way our shelter approach operates, our teachers for the Home Academy. And we think that that's very important for empowerment and also having ears on the ground to really listen to their concerns. The other thing about home that really inspires me is the team. We're very passionate and deeply care about the values that we stand for, which is justice, equality, dignity. And one thing that really inspires me is that we don't give up on our clients. And if you just look at our team, ethnic minorities are, I think, form major part of the team. So I think it's a very unique organization, which has come a long way in 15 years. In terms of what we are doing now in the pandemic, we are reaching out in the non-domestic side to workers outside of the dormitories. Just to give a context, we have about 750,000 low-wage workers. About half of them are in the dorms, but you have a sizable population living outside in the private accommodations. Those are the workers that we are trying to reach. Some of them have lost jobs. In fact, about 150 of them roughly in the last 1 month that we've seen have lost their jobs since mid-March or have been forced to take unpaid leave. So these are the kind of workers that we are reaching out to. And I wanted to say that while a lot of resources have gone into the bigger dorms, this is an area which is this is a segment that's vulnerable, and it's harder to reach because they are scattered. So that's one area that Home is looking at. Of course, we have our domestic worker programs. We are trying to do remote. We are trying to reach them through our remote hotlines, and many workers have reached out to us saying that because they're at home, and it's a very different way to work because you're living with your employers, so working hours have increased, caregiving roles, and advisory says you have to be at home, so rest days an issue, and we don't have clarity. So we are doing a lot of mediation there. In fact, we're getting 25% more cases to our hotline on the domestic worker side. Our shelter is at full capacity, so we have to also look at safe distancing measures and keeping our residents safe during this time. So that's, again, a steep learning curve, and we are trying to see how we operate differently, especially looking after mental health and well-being when residents are inside. The biggest part is, of course, raising issues and pointing out gaps that need to be filled. That is our advocacy piece, which has become all the more relevant in these times. So that's a bit about Home and what we are doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for sharing. And I think what comes up from your description also, which I'm sure all of us will address in the course of today's webinar, is that the dormitories may have gained our attention, but there's a lot more going on outside of the dormitories, and I think we'd like to be able to talk about that a bit more later. But for now, let's move on to Bernard. I think you're next.
Hello, everybody. Like my other speakers, I feel privileged to be invited today. So I'm going to start with a short sharing about the Migrant Workers Center. We were formed in 2009, and very quickly off the bat, oh, by the way, we're an outfit operated by the National Trades Union Congress, so we're a labor movement organization. Very quickly off the bat, when we were founded, we decided to put our heads down and start involving ourselves in casework, also as a basis through which to get a greater understanding of what the situation was with migrant workers and the challenges that they faced on a day-to-day basis. So after a few years, we managed to bring our casework up to a level where we thought we had enough of a body of case experience. Today, we process, on the average in the last few years, about 4,000 cases where we assist migrant workers navigate various statutory recovery processes, be it for salary, for injury, and other problems they may face. So after a few years, we decided that we've reached a critical mass of case experience, and the natural progression was to start doing advocacy work also, because we by then had a good experience of some of the key challenges that were plaguing migrant workers. So in response to that, we started doing a lot of engagement and rights awareness work among migrant workers as well as among employers, because many employers, if they hire through agents and all that, some of them are not too clear themselves on what it is their responsibilities are towards their migrant workers. And of course, on the advocacy piece, we also did a lot of advocacy work in several directions, actually, incidentally, also on housing related rights and entitlements of migrant workers, and how to improve the housing environment as a whole. But we also did some work on contracts, and of course, together with the efforts of everybody else, managed to get at least key employment terms for migrant workers included in the local statutes by 2016. So we have had several small victories along the way with regards to our advocacy work. And one of the key pieces that we continue to advocate for is on salary, and basically involves things like we've had some success with getting pay slips mandated. And now, actually, I think along with some other organizations, we've turned our attention towards trying to get electronic banking salaries for work permit holders mandated in our rules. Today, they're not yet mandated, not yet compulsory, but our hope is quite optimistic that it'll be able to be made compulsory pretty soon. Aside from all this work over the years, we've also, a lot like what Catherine has mentioned for home, we've accumulated quite a large body of migrant worker volunteers. Over at MWC, we call them our ambassadors. Today, we have about 5,000 of them. They feed into a lot of the work that we do, a lot of the advocacy work that we do. But in pre-COVID times, they also helped us carry out certain functions on the ground. For example, there's dissemination of new laws, new advisories, or any kind of direction from the government to the rest of the workers to help them understand and maybe comply a bit more in a widespread manner. And also what they would do is to help us ground sense, and that we hope would give us some kind of a predictive capability if there was problems that were on the horizon. If we could try and meet and address those quickly, then hopefully we could prevent them from becoming bigger problems. The other thing I wanted to talk about was because in recent years we found that the majority of our cases is with respect to salary related claims. So short payment, non-payment, part payment, late payment, unlawful deductions, anything related to salary. Today they make up about 2/3 of the cases that we handle annually. And as a result of that, and further wanting to champion the welfare of migrant workers that have to go through salary claims, we've partnered with the Ministry of Manpower. And for the since late 2018, today what happens is for a small group of migrant workers that go through the statutory salary claims process and are unsuccessful in affecting the salary orders that are granted to them. either because the employer has absconded or the employer is undergoing financial problems themselves. The Migrant Workers Center, through our charity, the Migrant Workers Assistance Fund, we pay out ex gratia assistance to migrant workers, unsuccessful salary claimants, up to $4,000 per worker. At the same time, some of these workers, the employment relationship with the employers has broken down, and this may have led to a situation where the employer no longer provides housing and other kinds of daily needs and sustenance for the worker. The MWC is also now the referral partner of the Tripartite Alliance for Dispute Management for those kinds of cases. We maintain a shelter in peacetime that can take up to 120 workers. But whether or not there's space in the shelter, so far we've been able to find solutions and underwrite the housing and other needs of workers while they remain here waiting the result of their claims. Yeah, so that's what I have to say so far. I look forward to this discussion later. Thanks.
Thanks, Bernard. That's plenty, and it's very useful to hear how the organization has evolved, and also the main achievements that you've been able to and the impact that you've been able to make. And we'll also have some opportunity later for the other organizations to also make a self-assessment of what their impact has been. But I suppose important for us also is to know what else you would like to do, like to be able to do, what difficulties you face in trying to achieve these other goals as the pandemic rolls ahead, right? Rolls forward. So we'll have an opportunity to talk a bit more about those things, but let's move on to Debbie next.
Hi, it's very nice to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. A little bit about TWC2. We started out at about the same time as Home, and we were registered as a charitable society in 2004. We were started by a group of people who were concerned mainly about advocacy and research. And over the years, we've developed in lots of different ways, and we have moved into certain direct services, but we've never lost sight of our advocacy and research role. We want that to be mainly what we do. Even though a lot of our efforts are put into direct services, particularly when we started the free meal program for workers with ongoing claims, that gave us a chance to speak on a regular basis to people who had made salary claims or injury claims or had some kind of ongoing problem and were no longer staying in the dorms because of either threats by their employers, or they felt the need to escape from that situation. But that gave us a lot of firsthand information. It takes up an awful lot of our time to do that sort of casework. But on the other hand, it feeds into our information of systemic problems that exist. Besides those systemic problems, it also allows us to incorporate a lot of volunteers. So we do have people coming on to volunteer, and this gives hands-on experience to a greater number of people, so that increases awareness all around, and it brings a lot more skills to what we do. But as for these systemic problems, we do what we can to solve the problem for the individual. We always have that uppermost in our mind, but we see patterns, and those are patterns of structural problems within the regulatory system that governs especially the work permit. So we see loopholes and incoherent regulations and contradictory messages and lack of enforcement and these kinds of things, which means that very often when that claim is resolved, it's not resolved satisfactorily from the point of view of the worker or from our point of view. So these kinds of things are constantly a source of a source of frustration and severe anxiety for the workers involved. But for us, it gives us information, valuable stories and valuable information. I have to say, if anybody wants to see more about that, look at our website. The TWC2 website is filled with stories, analysis, and suggestions about how to move forward on these things. One more thing that I'd like to say is, I'm very happy to be on this particular panel with this group because we do work very closely with one another. And I think that we all are seeing the same kinds of problems and doing what we can to solve them. But we have a good relationship with these other organizations on a organizational level and also on personal level. So it's a good group that you're hosting here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Debbie. That's really nice to hear, because again, it's one of the things that we in the public don't necessarily know about how civil society organizations function on their own, as well as in collaboration with the others. I was also very interested to hear you say at the beginning that research is part of, was at least the sort of founding concern of TWC. To a kind of research-based advocacy. Perhaps that's something we can talk a bit more about later as well. But before we do that, let's hear from Ing Cho.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. My name is Ing Cho. I'm from Citizen Adventures. What we do is we do tours and social initiatives in Geylang and Dakota Crescent. Our main body of work actually recognizes these neighborhoods as ecosystems with the issues that we talk about being interconnected. So I think we are one tier below like the research and advocacy groups that you guys really represent and in doing casework. But for us, we're really moving towards changing public perception, which we believe in order for public policy to change, that is one of the main requirements as well. So for us, our main pillars of work include not just doing tours, but raising awareness about social issues. With regards to migrant workers, we work with a group called Singapore Migrant Friends. Started 7 years ago when I played badminton with a group of migrant workers in Geylang as I lived there all my life. And it was really an eye-opening experience being friends with them and realizing eventually that although we were similar ages, they led such different lives. And I think what astounded me was really the stories of sacrifice that every one of them shared with me in such a very like low-key way that really fascinated me in terms of the decision-making and challenges and sacrifices that they have to make, and really reminding me of the voices of even our predecessors, like my grandfather as a migrant, hearing about the stories of Singaporeans in the past, early generations coming to Singapore and working the low-wage jobs, the difficult environment, and yet eventually having what we call home today. So I think that fascination also came with a bit of discomfort, because I think in Singapore, the migrant workers that we know nowadays are quite excluded from our society in terms of the activities, the means of affording, of going to certain places. And for me, it was really discomforting seeing them part of the ecosystem of Singapore, but not really represented in different ways. And at Geylang Adventures, we really want to bring and shed light onto that ecosystem and their interconnectivity to us as well. The issues that we see on the ground, a reflection of our society's priorities, and moving forward, how do we represent and champion, I think, these causes, and not just that, but these population of people who are my personal friends as well. So that's really my motivation. Singapore Migrant Friends now is a group of migrant workers that play volleyball at Kallang every weekend, and we support them through organizing activities. We also do casework with the migrant workers and their friends. We do referrals, in fact, to TWC2, HealthServe, and Home as well, depending if they're foreign domestic worker or a construction worker. We also give haircuts called Back Alley Barbers. So we cut hair at TWC2 and HealthServe for their workers as well. So these are the social initiatives that we run on the side, and with the belief that the interconnectivity of this ecosystem has all of us to play a part in. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And that's also a very refreshing view, right? To hear about the not only the ecosystemic significance of migrant workers in Singapore, but also kind of the basis in friendships, right? And maybe that's something we could talk about as well. I mean, is that maybe quite a foundational thing that we could do in order to solve what often appears to us as a technical policy problem, right? Is there some other component, the human, the relational, that might actually be much more fundamental to the problem? So thank you so much, all of you, for sharing those things about your organizations. We have a second round of questions, and these rounds of questions are really designed so that we can put a lot of things onto the table and then have a a richer discussion after that. So the second round of questions is about what you're actually seeing on the front lines. I know you're all looking cheerful and all of that, but you must be very, very tired people. I'm sure you've been working nonstop and for the most part, working at the front lines. And you would also, whilst you've been at the front lines, you would also have heard some of the more common impressions that have formed in people's minds about what the front line actually looks like, or even where exactly the front line is. Many of us imagine that we know where the front line is, but we may not be correct, or our impression might be different from what you're seeing. So for this round of questions, I would like to get from each of you one or two examples of what you've actually seen at the front lines, which are perhaps different from what most people might be thinking. So whoever's ready to share something, just jump in.
Okay, can I jump in first?
Please do, please do.
There has been so much attention to the dormitories, and therefore a lot of people think that the dormitories are the problem. They think all we need to do is fix the dormitories. Once we fix the dormitories, things will be fine. If the dormitories were made into five-star hotels, the underlying problems would still exist. So it's not about the dormitories. We have never had people come to us and have their major complaint be dormitories. It's always about salary, mostly salary, recruitment fees, medical attention. And of those, I would say that recruitment fees are one of the things that allows all these other problems to exist. If people didn't start their jobs as heavily indebted as they are, they would be in a better position to quit their jobs, to speak up about problems, to take a risk, to talk to the employer, to do something about it. But because of that very serious indebtedness, which might last for some workers as long as 2 years, that means 2 years of no money going to the family, going into savings, but just going to service the debt. That means that they will accept anything that is thrown at them. And so for the dormitories, many of the dormitories can be improved, but that should be secondary to all of these other issues.
Why do you think we have focused so much on the living conditions and the questions of hygiene? Why do you think we've focused on those things rather than what you just mentioned?
Shall I let somebody else speak? Or
sure. If you had a thought about that, you could also, or help anyone else.
I think it's the other things. We've been speaking about these other things. In fact, all of our organizations have been speaking about recruitment fees and salaries for a long time, but that just doesn't, it's because of the pandemic. It's because of COVID that everyone is focusing on the dormitories. So if I think that if any of these salary issues were occurring among Singaporeans, it would be front page news and people would want to do something about it. But because it's migrant workers, it occasionally gets a mention in the press. But I think people just don't realize how serious it is for these families. What we see among the people that we see hundreds of people every day. And when their claims are finished as badly as they are, we see people go home in tears saying, how can I go home? They often say to us, I would rather kill myself, but if I did that, what would happen to my family? So they're extremely distressed by money issues.
I hope we'll be able to unpack that a little bit more later when we ask ourselves the question of whether a focus on the dormitories has been actually a distraction rather than a means of focusing our attention on the real problems that lie before us. But let's move on to someone else. What are you seeing on the front lines?
Just wanted to echo what Debbie was saying, and we see the same thing. In most of our cases, none of the workers, unless you probe them, actually complain about their food or their living condition. They take it as a given. It's only because of the safe distancing measure, the outbreak, that suddenly you have media attention on it. But the real issues remain that they may be duped. They may be promised one salary and they may be paid something else altogether, if at all they're paid. So salary, and even now, the concerns are more to do with the family and whether they'll be able to hold on to their jobs, because there's so much at stake there. Recruitment costs, as Debbie mentioned, that they are in debt. it's years before they start really earning anything. So that's one of the misperceptions that we wanted to tell from the trenches, that yes, yes, now because there's Ramadan and they are confined, and there is this confinement in because of SHN and all of that lockdown, food has taken precedence, but in our normal course, that is not something that comes up very regularly.
Okay, thank you.
So
So
maybe,
that really reinforces the point. Bernard, please.
yeah, so okay, so I want to reinforce the point that Debbie made earlier, that actually we're all pretty friendly with each other. So I'm not so sure how others view us, but actually in person we're all pretty friendly, and a lot of the time we work together in partnership on cases or on issues. But I wanted to just maybe offer a slightly different perspective about the work that we're doing right at the moment now, together with COVID. So what many of the viewers may not know is we actually had a prior conversation on this a couple of days ago amongst ourselves to discuss some of the things that we would be saying. And, the MWC, I think it's been reported quite widely in the media that we've been, brought in pretty early to work with the government to have some kind of a coordinated response to deal with the issues in the dormitories. That is not to say they are a root problem, not a root problem or anything like that. But I think that the reason why a coordinated effort was needed for the dormitories is because of the sheer number of migrant workers that live in the dormitories. And because many of the issues, when they started having movement restrictions within the dormitories, were quite urgent issues and concerned needs that need to be addressed very quickly. And while the government took the lead in some of the bigger dormitories, I think the thinking was, at least in the beginning, that the big dormitories needed to be addressed quickly because of the size of the population within these big dormitories. But I think also at the same time, there are about more than 1,000 facilities scattered around Singapore with smaller populations, and the operators or management of these smaller dormitories usually did not have the bandwidth to handle the issues that perhaps were not so urgent in the beginning when the purpose-built dormitories were undergoing the gazettes and all that. But we could already almost predict that they would eventually get more and more serious. And so quite early on in this piece, at least the MWC for ourselves, we identified that any way we could try to alleviate the concerns and the challenges of these smaller operators, perhaps just by addressing certain needs like daily supplies of their workers, considering the fact that movement for their workers in and out of the dormitory would soon come under considerable restriction, so they wouldn't be able to purchase, daily essentials, for example, soap, shampoo, sanitizer, laundry detergent, toothbrush, toothpaste, things like that. So we targeted that and tried to address that situation at scale, meaning with charitable funds, we went to procure or obtain through in-kind donations enough to supply all the factory converted dormitories or all the purpose-built dormitories. So, and the reason for doing that is because it would be 1, 2, or 3 less things to worry about for the operators of these dormitories. Then they could divert their attention to thinking about the more important things, which is caring for themselves and also their residents, the migrant workers that live in their dormitories, and start to implement anti-COVID measures like, safe distancing, the wearing of masks, and things like that. So very quickly off the bat, what we did, completed round about the beginning of April already, we basically distributed 370,000 reusable masks to all the dormitories. And then followed up with things like soap and laundry detergent and all that, all in large quantities to target everybody. And also one of the reasons why the dormitories were slightly more urgent was because, my colleagues are right to point out that quite a sizable population of migrant workers also live amongst us in the private residential properties and all that. But I think the slight difference in the restrictions on the people in the private residential properties were very different from those in dorms. For the workers in dorms, they would be prevented from coming out at all. And therefore, the problem was a little bit more urgent for them and the operators of these dormitories. Whereas in the private residential properties, they essentially had the same restrictions on movement as Singaporeans. So they could nominate one person in the household to go out and purchase sundries and supplies if the need arose. Whereas that would not have been possible for residents in the dormitory. So I'm just trying to maybe clarify the little bit of a difference in urgency with respect to both.
Yeah.
Michael, go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry, I'll just do a quick sharing. Firstly, I think, you asked a question whether it was a deflection of, and just trying to see whether we are not tackling the real cause.
Yeah.
To be honest, it's actually two working parts right now, isn't it? Currently, we are in a pandemic, and it is a living conditions that everyone is in, and the numbers are really great. I mean, it's really high of those workers who are currently in the big dormitories, and they are the ones who are currently with COVID-19 positives. So I think to have some coverage on that, it's natural, and that come to people asking why are they living in such conditions and things like that, and that's natural as well, I think, because that suddenly people realize, oh wow, migrant workers have been living like this. Have they really been in such a cramped space? What we're trying to say is that all these are true and real, and it is happening, but it's not necessarily the number one concern of the migrant workers themselves. In our conversations with them, generally, there are always two things that comes up with us. If we go to the dorms and we are able to engage with them and speak with them, and most of the time they will ask us questions like, I'm COVID positive. What's going to happen to me? Will I ever recover fully? Will the virus actually leave my body 100%? Will I be like a normal person again? Or will this stay with me for the rest of my life? So that's always a question one. And then soon after, almost immediately after, they will tell me that, you know what, I'm not the only one suffering. My family is suffering back home. I'm not earning any income today. I'm not able to really send anything because everything's on a lockdown as well. So what's going to happen? Just a very, very recent conversation, and it's probably just about a few days ago. One of them just told me this, that says that my mom called me that day and told me that I have no idea what I'm going to feed your wife, your child, because I'm running out of food. Maybe today may be our last meal for rice. Can you help? And so we're trying to frame that the idea of that, the needs are real, the dormitory needs are real. We need to look into this, I guess, is somewhat important. But there's also another major issue that we also would like to look into, which is the economic, the salary, the power imbalance. And those are the things that we probably have been dealing with for a long time as well. So, yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Before we move on to Incho, which I'm sure will have a lot to say about this, I just wanted to flag that point because many of the questions that are coming in are asking us to meditate on the question of where are these, what is the future of these dormitories, right? If we do accept that it is part of the problem, may not be the full problem or the most important part, but it does seem to be generating a lot of the problems. So how are we supposed to think about the future of these types of purpose-built dormitories? Are there alternatives? So perhaps we can spend a little bit of time later reflecting on that. But Incho, please share.
Great. So I just wanted to also echo both sides of the coin that Debbie, Catherine, Bernard, and Michael shared. So I think I represent today COVID Migrant Support Coalition. We started on the first day of the circuit breaker the intention was actually to gather the smaller organizations in the space to come together with resources to also serve the migrant workers. And I think our purpose of coming together was actually seeing it as a humanitarian relief operation. And I think that's what's missing in a lot of conversations right now, where it can be quite intellectualized or serious, when we talk about the policy aspects, but the human aspects of lives on the ground are something that is often overlooked in this current crisis. So in terms of a humanitarian relief mission, for us, it's really getting the essential items out as fast as possible. So that required us to convert to a bulk procurement model, where we now procure a list of standard items to deliver to dormitories in terms of dry supplies, medical supplies, and cleaning and sanitation hygiene products. That's really the main thing that we started out to do. But as we worked the ground, we realized that there were other needs as well. From the position of safety, for example, from a worker, this was when COVID was just starting out. Many of them knew how to practice like safe distancing and the kind of hygiene measures that they needed to take. But the reality was that they couldn't really do it in the context of the dormitories that they lived in. So for us, it was really hearing a lot of concerns of their personal safety, being helpless, being unable to do all these safe distancing practices in the dormitories. And for that, we also heard from the dormitory operators, like what Bernard shared, the factory converted ones, where they were generally smaller with hundreds of workers in there, and generally not what the media portrays in terms of the display of what dormitory represents. So factory converted dorms, as the name suggests, are factories first. And because the dormitories come secondary, often when you walk into the space, you don't see the workers. And factory converted dormitories are often in further parts of Singapore because they are in the manufacturing industrial areas. And so many of them that live there don't really have access to the provision shops or the supermarkets because they don't have many of that nearby. So one of the immediate needs that we saw that operators were struggling with was in a conversion from SHN to from being able to buy groceries to a SHN lockdown for the workers. In the short span of a few days, they had to procure large amount of items for hundreds of workers. And from, again, the position of safety, the dorm operators were not very prepared and not very able to do that. And so we saw that as an immediate need as well. I think looking long term, the short, medium term needs are actually what Debbie and Catherine raised. The salary issues are definitely one of the main concerns of workers because of job insecurity. I think everyone in this economy of Singapore will suffer. And it's really about how do you help them to manage and buffer the losses, if any, in these circumstances. So it's going to be a deluge of workers who will be losing their jobs, who will be unable to get their salary in this time. And many of them, as was shared as well, have many dependents back home. And I think many people here don't really recognize that link to their homes in Bangladesh and India, wherever they are from. Many of them have actually dependents and they are very stressed, especially with this dependency that the families have. And so for us, it's also looking at mental health and wellness programs, and apart from also having a casework function, and also supporting the work of other NGOs like HealthServe, TWC2, in funneling workers that we encounter with such challenges to them as well, playing that supporting role. Yeah. So thanks for letting me speak. Yeah.
Thank you. Such a pleasure to hear all of that. And from all of your contributions, we do get very strongly the sense of how, at one very deep and systemic and structural level, it's something to do with policy, it's something to do with the politics of this, it's something to do with power distribution and all of that, which we must attend to hopefully later today. And then it's the dormitories themselves, which are a kind of physical design problem. Maybe it has something to do with the economics, the political economy of it. And then what you're also telling us very richly is that there is a humanitarian problem at the very heart of it that also cannot and shouldn't be ignored. And I think that's a very, while we will keep the question of the dormitory design and operation later, and the policies later, let's now tackle this question of the human problem at the center of it. And I'd like you to respond actually in terms of a lot of the questions are asking this, in terms of how ordinary Singaporeans can contribute to this, right? And so obviously you've been able to mobilize a lot of ground generosity and the feelings of charity in order to mobilize the things that the community needs. I guess there must be a lot of empathy that has emerged out of this crisis. So one of the new questions that come up is, what can we do with this emerging empathy, and can we build that up into a firmer sort of approach to solving the bigger problems? So what do we do with this empathy? And secondly, the most practical question is, I'm an ordinary Singaporean, right? I'm not sure what I'm good at, what I can do. I'm not sure that even if I helped you, whether I would be doing good or be giving you more problems to deal with, right? So I want to know, as an ordinary Singaporean, what is it that you would like me to contribute to you? So whoever feels like answering that, please go ahead.
Can I
Michael,
start?
Please do.
Yeah. But firstly, I think we are very, very thankful in HealthServe. We have a large support from a large group of volunteers. We have over 400 to 500 volunteers that actually come alongside with us, and we cannot do our work without any of these volunteers. So at one of the things that you're talking about, the humanitarian, what can we do? One of the most basic thing that we can start off with our attitudes, I guess, a change of attitudes towards a migrant worker. View them as a common humanity and not as an economic tool. And that's one thing that we could change, and that would move a lot of boundary and obstacles. Also, another thing that we probably can view them is that they're not, well, one of the things that in our conversations at times is they view migrant workers as a threat to society. They view that they will probably riot at the smallest of things. And in getting to know the worker, if you just speak with them, you come to realize these are such a relational people. They love music, they love poetry. They have so much knowledge about the things of gardening, farming, and they can share with you a lot of things. And they'll share with you about all the things that they've built as well. If you just walk down, sometimes Shenton Way or so, they will tell you, this building I helped build. That tile, yeah, that was where actually I had an injury over there. And you start to realize that there are more to it, and he's more than just a person here to help us in our economical gains. He is a person, a son or a father, and that's very important for us to remember. And so, yeah, sorry. So quickly to answer the second question about what else can volunteer come and do. At HealthServe, at least we do still continue to run our clinics. However, we do ask that we currently need medical volunteers, those with medical certifications that will help us tremendously. People with counseling skills, we are always reaching out to anyone with counseling skills to come alongside with us, to volunteer with us. And actually as well, I mean, in terms of just needs, basically, in terms of donations, that will help us. The reason why I think donations is easier for us than donations in kind, because we actually providing some of and meeting the direct needs on the workers. A case in point, some of the workers are now not able to even pay their shelter, and they risk being evicted by the landlords. I mean, it's by no fault of anyone, it's just the way it is, right? And how we're coming alongside is that we'll say, okay, can we help you? Can we actually support, like maybe your just 1 month to help you, stabilize before you need to move on. So that's why donations will be helpful towards any of our organizations. And as everyone, we work very, very closely together. So it doesn't have to be HealthServe. You can please donate to TWC2, Home, MWC, and even Geylang Adventures or CMSC for that matter. Yeah, and we're all supporting this cause. Yeah.
Thank you. Before we move on, I just want to also build on one point that you made earlier, which is this notion of a common humanity, right? Recognizing them as people just as we are people. So I picked that up because I myself struggle sometimes to understand our response, right? There are many among us who, one of you used the word deluge of help, right? There's a flood of assistance. So clearly people are responding in a very generous and empathetic way. So I wonder, what is it? Are they doing this because they recognize the common humanity? Are they doing this because it's a, I don't know, a sense of pity, or is it a spectacle that demands this reaction? Are they doing it out of guilt? And yet, at the same time, on the other end of the spectrum, there have been reports of people who've been a little less tolerant, right? I mean, sometimes words like racist and xenophobic have also been used to describe that end of the spectrum. How should we understand this response from Singaporeans? Is it all mixed up in each one of us, or are they just different people who are behaving differently? How do we make this a sustainably helpful kind of development? Bernard, please.
Okay, yes. I think I want to address this from the perspective of operations on the ground, and for an organization like ours, which we have experienced a considerable surge in people wanting to come forward and donate items, donate money, and also volunteer, in our operations to support the ongoing effort against COVID-19. And I think I want to echo a little bit about what Michael said also, and also use the words that Injo had used. To a certain extent, some of the work that we're doing right now can really be said to be a humanitarian relief effort. And in a situation like that, usually the urgency is pretty high. I don't know, my colleagues on the panel can disagree with me or agree with me, but in a situation like that, usually within the organization, with the MWC itself, it's all hands on deck, a kind of situation. And
Bernard, I think you're breaking off.
Sorry, can you hear me? Yeah.
Now, yes.
Yeah, okay. So all hands on deck kind of situation. And in a situation like that, when we get in-kind donations, what it does is it takes up quite a bit of time and attention and effort to try and match something that comes in to an existing need on the ground or an urgent need on the ground. So Michael didn't go as far as to say this, but in a situation like that, we really would welcome help in terms of money rather than in-kind donations. So just to give everybody a very obvious example, we've had donations or offers of everything from, I used this example before, 5 fruit baskets. I mean, there's not very much I'm going to be able to do with 5 fruit baskets, but at the end of the day, I need to be able to not completely turn off this donor. So I need to spend the time to manage him and say, thank you for your intention to help the migrant workers and all that. But this takes time and effort and logistics, which actually could distract us from the actual urgent work that we think we should be putting our attention to. In respect of all Singaporeans and what maybe any ordinary Singaporean could do, I've already mentioned this at a previous forum. What I have tended to find was in previous big incidents or big events concerning migrant workers, I would see the same surge in care and concern for migrant workers. I would see the same surge in people wanting to come forward and volunteer and donate. And also, I would see a lot of online discourse on how things could be improved and things like that. And at each event, while it was happening, I would have this hope that this would continue and this would continue to persist and be sustained after the event was resolved or concluded. But unfortunately, I tended to see some of this concern and involvement grind slowly to a halt very soon after we came out of that particular crisis. So I think if you ask me what the ordinary Singaporean could do, I would say continue to be an active citizen, continue to contribute your views, continue to offer your opinions, even in the aftermath of COVID-19, after we deal with some of these urgent problems. Contribute when there are consultations and when the review that has been more or less promised by the government is conducted on housing issues and the other issues surrounding migrant workers. I think that is when we need most concerned Singaporeans to be most active, because in events in the past, what we found when we've come out of these events is that it's not very helpful if when we overcome the problems, that it's the 5 or 6 of us that are still there advocating for these things. So my encouragement to the ordinary Singaporean that really wants to contribute to make lasting change or sustain change would be to continue talking, to continue to have these conversations, and also continue to show that, look, as a society, we really want to move forward on a lot of these things when it comes to migrant workers' rights. If enough people come together and enough Singaporeans show that this is the direction we want to go, then generally, not only our government, any government for that matter, would have a duty first to listen to its people. And so that's been my hope all along. It's my hope for when we come out of COVID-19, and I hope that concerned Singaporeans now they can take this to heart and they can continue the conversations after we come out of this.
So what you said towards the end was you used the word migrant worker rights, and that you would like Singaporeans to continue to have conversations that might address something like migrant worker rights. I think that's quite an interesting point to make, and I hope we'll get to that later. Other people, other than money and conversations, what else?
I just wanted to add to what Bernard said, and he brings in a point about the capacity of NGOs themselves to absorb in a pandemic and in a normal peacetime volunteering opportunities. And for that, I would like to just give an overview of how our operations and strategy has changed in a pandemic. In the initial weeks, I think we all were in parts of WhatsApp groups. We were scrambling to find volunteers who were speaking different languages just to translate a lot of material and information that was coming out. I mean, I could go into that we don't have information about breakdown by nationality, but the point is that we realized that we needed Korean translator, Thai, and besides the Bangladeshi and Indian languages. And so the requirements of volunteering and how people could support was different. And then our own strategy, at least I could say for home was like, we should be looking at case management support. A lot of workers are going to lose jobs. That's where our competencies lie. But then we had the stay-at-home notice, and then suddenly you had this. We were providing financial assistance, but the kind of assistance also changes. Now we are looking at having to provide groceries because workers are staying in private accommodation with other workers, all of them unable to step out. So the needs are also changing on the ground. So like Bernard said, in-kind support is good, but it also, we are a small team, and it kind of stretches us to kind of look at the logistical requirements of matching, this. I was telling this to someone that our office is looking more like NTUC now. There's so much of staff and coordinating. In a normal time, you have one man, one van, and then suddenly the team was looking at, we reached out to about 200 workers in 30 locations. Just the sheer effort of it, of moving supplies to one place is just huge. But we are also moved by how younger Singaporeans have contributed behind the scenes, working very tirelessly, just looking at how we are communicating, how we are trying to do, say, Zoom, Zoom courses for domestic workers. And there's different ways of engaging. And even today, this kind of conversation, I'm hoping, will continue, like Bernard said, post-COVID, that on a Saturday, you have 500 plus people joining in to discuss migrant workers and how we could change. You have media talking about issues, bringing issues not just that are sensational, but more structural changes. And on that, also academia. I know that a lot of research in that community is also part of this. And what are the kind of research that we want to undertake? You know, what is universities, what are their areas that's of interest, you know? This could be something that is, that requires a rethink. So there's different ways to contribute, and I hope it continues post-COVID. I also wanted to make a quick remark on what Yincha said and Michael touched about anxiety, mental health, the human stories. One of the things that we also see, and this because this is about from the trenches, workers are concerned not just about salaries, but about losing their jobs. Fear of breaking stay-at-home notices, and you know the punishments are quite harsh. So we also have to be looking at how our response is, you know, adhered, is anchored in compassion. Because you lose a job means, you know, $8,000 that was paid as recruitment that suddenly left in whole family. It affects not just that worker. So there's a lot of aspects to it, and this is a time of uncertainty for all of us, and especially so for migrant workers. So these human aspects need to be considered in our pandemic response.
Thank you very much. Debbie, I'm sure you've got plenty to say.
Yes. Everyone else has been very good about bragging what they've done during the pandemic, and I would be remiss if I didn't do the same. One of the things that we've done is we've been able to top up phone cards for over 40,000 men who are stuck in dorms. So we thought, this is what we can do. We knew that there are a lot of other organizations that are meeting the needs as far as food and face masks and, you know, various other things, you know, the material things. But phone card top-ups give them a lifeline to their families, and to their friends. So often they're stuck in places, they're moved to other places. So phone communication is important. Also, when you're stuck, it allows for entertainment as well. But with that phone top up, we've also established communications with tens of thousands of people. And now we're asking about salaries. So information coming from MOM about what the employer is supposed to do or suggested to do or might do if he feels like it has been very unclear and convoluted, and it confuses the employers as well as the workers. So they see a certain figure and they think that's the money that's coming to them. They don't know that that money that is coming to the employer is meant for the care and upkeep of the employer and maybe for his salary as well. So there's an awful lot of confusion. The other thing that we've done besides try to find out about their salaries is we have a team of interpreters who are getting WhatsApp calls from these guys asking for clarification. So this is one thing that I won't say we're solving the problem. I would say the problem is the message is not clear. So this is also contributing to it. So looking a little bit down the road, we're going to hit a situation where the men feel that they haven't been paid properly, or they know they haven't been paid properly, or the money is clawed back through various deductions. The employer might claim that these deductions were for housing and food, but was it really? So this is a flood that we're expecting to see is about salaries. Then job security. Past this, job security is the main thing. Singapore will slowly try to revive the economy, and the economy depends on construction. So which workers are they going to have? Are they going to keep these men on until the construction industry is up to speed and can re-employ them? Or are they going to send them back and bring in a whole new batch? This is something that is really of great concern. So that just brings me back to, if they're allowed to stay here, what happens if their employer has gone bust? Will they be allowed to switch jobs? Will it be possible to switch jobs? Will the new employer also ask for kickbacks from that new employee? So this is what we've seen in the past, is even when those men are given permission to change employers, the new employer still wants kickbacks. Because if he gets a new worker from home country, that man's going to give kickbacks. Why shouldn't this man who's in Singapore already take kickbacks as well? So construction has been so profitable for Singapore because it's been on the backs of migrant workers who are certainly underpaid. Now, some may be doing well, but the fact that we see possibly 10% of construction workers, that indicates there's a tremendous problem. So going forward, I think that what people should do, there has been an outpouring of support in money and in kind. And this is good to see, but I think that everyone who's concerned now should keep their eye on the ball and not just look at this as a problem that needs to be solved during these, we hope, only few months where workers are not permitted to work. But we hope that they continue to look at the problem as it plays out. What's going to happen to these workers who are here now, who may not get what they are supposed to get, and will they be sent home? So money and families. That's all.
Thank you. There are a few questions, just taking off from what you just said. There are a few questions that speak to the problem of compassion fatigue, right? That we are very focused now on doing our best for the problem. But if we accept that the problem is beyond just a dormitory issue, but a bigger one to do with the structures, the system, maybe even the global industry, right? In migration industry, if you like. This is not something that's going to disappear even with our best efforts. So what are we going to do about things like we're not going to be able to keep up the kindness, right? Keep up the keeping an eye on these issues, because it's going to tire us out after a while, and it's going to go back to square one maybe. So I guess what some of these questions are suggesting is we do need to pay attention to the larger structures that are creating these problems. There is a question here also about what have you sensed in your interactions with the migrant workers? How do they, what do they think about the policies themselves? What do they think about the way that we, think of the economic purposes of having migration and so do they have views about these things? Do they share them with you quietly? Can we hear a little bit about that? Anyone?
Yeah, happy to start.
Please.
So I think with our interactions with migrant workers, especially during COVID, as we meet them in the dorms or online, as they call in for help, one of the things that they actually like is a reassurance element in terms of clarity of information. So for example, when we receive calls for help for workers in providing meals, we actually have due diligence functions in our casework where we not just capture what the issues that they're facing, whether it's because they're unpaid, unable to access to food, but we also have a loop to feedback and send this information to MOM for investigation. So I think this due diligence is important because we don't want to feed workers and wean off responsibility from employers unknowingly. And for us, it's also actually seeing that the workers feel a lot more reassured with certain policy enforcement measures that is being taken. And some of them, the employers actually do come back to feed them. And for many of the workers, it could be a lack of communication with the employer, or sometimes employers are not aware of the rules or the need to provide food during circuit breaker. And so these are the circumstances as to which we bridge that communication. So having the policies in place are definitely good. But I think the economic realities still stand in terms of job insecurity in this COVID period. So even for our volunteers as well, we have coalition members, 200 volunteers right now, and all of them are all like volunteers with regular jobs, or some of them transitioning because of COVID as well. And we have long-term and medium-term programs like mental health and befriending function. We're starting also a reassurance pool together with HealthServe to reassure the workers and dorm operators on the ground who may have COVID or COVID positive cases within their midst. And these interactions with the workers, many of their priorities are also on the need for a perception of safety. So whether it's clarity of information in terms of how do I recover from COVID, or even the type of equipment that they will need to clean the toilets, for example, are things that they don't really know about. So what we have been doing is distributing PPE together with the help of HealthServe and the supply of PPE that they have. to these workers and operators who are working in these confined locations with COVID positive. And I think many of them do feel reassurance with the presence of information. And I think the clarity that comes from policies or advisories is extremely important in this case, because that will allow the message to be passed down, not just from employers or dorm operators, but from NGOs or volunteers like us. And I think working hand in hand in the government on this is extremely important, because the advisories and official quarantine orders, procedures, or even things like what is a packing list on what to bring if you are relocated to community isolation facilities, these information will be extremely helpful in this time of uncertainty. And this representation of the link between government, civil society, and also the complementary parts that we play is suggested as well in our relationship with migrant workers.
Thank you very much. We unfortunately have only about 15 minutes left, and I thought that one way that we can spend this last 15 minutes is to kind of narrow down to a few takeaways from each of you. There's a question here about what sort of longer term asks would you put to the policymakers in terms of protections for migrants in Singapore? So if policymakers were listening to this, what would you like them to hear, right? And can I ask you to answer that in terms of three things? So for each of you to say, number one, give us a low-hanging fruit that we must not miss, right? We always talk about not wasting a crisis, and here is one, right? So what should we not miss? Number two, what longer-term change, what sort of policy change would you like us to keep an eye on? What would you press for? And number three, you know, you're all such friendly people and obviously already working together, but is there something else we can do in the name of collaboration, right? Whether it's within civil society itself, can you be collaborating more? Can you be collaborating better? Or can you be collaborating with people outside of civil society? And maybe say something also about that relationship with the state. I mean, we talk about this view from the trenches. We use a war analogy. And with war analogies, there's a lot of hierarchy, there are generals, there are foot soldiers. You know, is that how we should think about civil society going forward? Or is there some other better metaphor for making us a much more resilient country? So you can sign off by answering those three things. Who would like to start?
Happy to start.
Please do, Catherine.
And I'll try to, we've touched upon some of these issues before. For me, the low-hanging fruit from the non-domestic, for the male migrant worker side, is looking at the salary issues. That jumps out as a critical issue that we'll see more of in the post-pandemic, you know, in the immediate months and in the longer-term months. So I think it's important for all our work-life balance that we address some of these salary issues so that we don't have this deluge of cases that we mentioned. And one way could be just a simple thing of most of the cases that come to home, they do not have electronic salary. They don't have salary slip. Bernard mentioned it. It's still optional for work permit holders. I'm not saying that will solve all the issues, but it could address some of the issues. So electronic salary payment that is also linked to the pay slip, so that we have some sense of accountability and some of the wage disputes can be addressed, especially when you have you know, a kind of reduced economic activity. Construction sector itself is going through a crisis of sorts. The role of state is obviously very important. In the construction sector alone, about 60% of the demand is public sector demand. So what the state can do in some of these issues is definitely, you know, a big part. So that's on the non-domestic side. On the domestic side, based on the calls that we are getting, we definitely need clearer guidelines on rest day, you know, payment in lieu for rest day work. Rest day guidelines are still so vague. You know, what is rest day? Is it 24 hours? Because most of the domestic workers still work in the mornings before they go and they come back, they're not paid. So this is one of the issues that have come again and again, and this is one area that Home has been kind of advocating on. So these are two low-hanging fruits that definitely come to my mind.
Just a very quick question, just a very quick question on the e-payments. It sounds like an obviously good thing, and I imagine everyone on this panel would agree with that. Why hasn't it been put in place after such a long time? You must have been advocating this for a very long time. What's holding it back?
It is still optional for work permit holders. And then if you look at, if you just look at where we've come in this pandemic, you know, I think, Bernard, is it right that you have 100,000 bank accounts that were opened? And because you realized that, you know, workers needed to be paid in, even when they were in the lockdown dorms and all, but most of the cases that come to us are not paid actually. Payslips are completely out of the picture. So you need both, but they would both need to be connected. So the payslip has to talk to the electronic salary.
So that's a gap in the will, or in the will to do it, or is it a technical problem, or why can't it be done?
So by virtue of Catherine's arrow, thank you, Catherine. I think I'll go next.
Please, yeah.
I see low-hanging fruit. I'm going to try and tackle this, the 1, 2, 3 points that you laid out for us, Kenneth.
Yes.
As low-hanging fruit, I not only see in terms of ease of achieving, but in terms of urgency, something we can do very quickly now. I mentioned earlier, and I allude back to what Debbie said also, I think a lot of us are expecting a surge in layoffs and salary claims for migrant workers as we slowly come out of the very strict movement restrictions now at the dormitories. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if the lockdown was relaxed and the next thing you see is groups of people marching down to MOM in Vandermeer Road where they filed their salary claims. I mentioned earlier that we've been in partnership with the Tripartite Alliance for Dispute Management since 2018. And for many of these claims that are unsuccessful, and one of the reasons why they would be unsuccessful is where the employer is unable to pay because of financial distress. We fully expect that many employers, especially at the small, medium enterprise level, whose resources are not large to begin with, will basically be affected adversely after the strain of the past 2 months. And basically, not because it's deliberately not paying their worker or whatever, the situation just doesn't allow them to make payments. So we will have this group of workers we fully expect that are coming forward with these issues. And the MWC, right at the moment, is now trying to, I use the term, get all our ammunition and resources together to try and prepare for this deluge, because we happen to be the ex gratia payment partner of the Tripartite Alliance for Dispute Management. And I think we are expecting, I mean, prior to COVID, I think per year, the amount we were paying out in ex gratia is slightly over $500,000 in terms of payments to workers that were unsuccessful in the claims. We expect this to balloon considerably. We don't yet know what exactly the factor of the multiple it is going to be, but we do think we're going to need quite a lot of resources. And that's actually also another reason why we say, because these payments are made from charitable donations from our charity. So another reason why we say, if you really want to contribute, one of the things you can do to have a more lasting and long-term impact on the migrant workers is to contribute monies. More longer-term change, I would see as the same as what Catherine mentioned. We've been arguing for electronic payment for migrant workers for a very long time now. One of the things we have done to try and create a more conducive space for the government to go on to mandate it is we started up our own membership program, partnered with POSB Bank. So basically the underlying condition to signing on as a member is that a local POSB bank account is open for you. And the thing is, we only launched it in April 2018. Today, we already have more than 200,000 members. So what this means is, it's a free of charge membership, of course, but what this means is we have at least 200,000 workers that are here right now that have already opened bank accounts. I think surveys have been done, and by and large, upwards of 75% of the workers in Singapore are already paid electronically. And this bears out, I think, with the case stats of everybody. Catherine mentioned it in brief earlier on. The kind of cases we see on salary abuses, salary malpractices, tend to be concentrated on the group where they are not paying via electronic payment, yet they're still paying in cash. So one of the quick wins, I think, especially the COVID period has shown us, is that the value of electronic payment, workers that were in the dorms during the lockdown, I think they benefited much more than those that were paid in cash, in terms of being able to see that your salary has been paid, make confirmation of that, and then electronically remit it back home. So they had a number of advantages over those that were still paid in cash. And then lastly, I think the question about collaboration. Again, I'm going to repeat it. Not a lot of people know about this, but I think we often come together, pretty good friends with everybody here on the panel. And I think everybody is much the same. If there is an issue plaguing a worker, that's part of a case that I'm handling, or any one of my colleagues on the panel is handling, and there was some kind of positive impact that could be made by someone else on the panel, I think today what we do is just one phone call, and no one ever says no. So we work very closely together on the ground when we're doing our case management work. In advocacy, I think for different NGOs, sometimes it makes a lot of sense for them because if they run on a charity, makes a lot of sense for them to be to articulate their advocacy positions as individuals rather than a group. And this is because concerns of funding and things like that. Yeah. So you need to show that you are doing something on your own. But having said that, there are a lot of congruences and confluences in the things that we are all championing for, and at a certain level, together with the Singaporean public. This is why I've always said, there's a role for everybody, and if we want to do as a community, we want to build a community where all sectors of our society value our migrant workers, treats them as human individuals, as equals, and if you say migrant care and the migrant rights are important, then beyond just us trying to get our advocacy collaborated, if we could get everybody out, and for ordinary Singaporeans to also show that these things were important to them, I think we really have a chance at making sustainable change for the future. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. Let's try hear from the others. And just let me slip in a question that came up. If any one of you is going to talk about e-payments too, there is a question here about how will e-payments prevent kickbacks, which I think are also quite a problem in this space. Go ahead, Debbie.
Okay. Thank you, Bernard. We love you too, first of all. Well, agree completely with Catherine and with Bernard about salaries, about pay slips and electronic payments. Bernard mentioned that figure of $500,000 going for ex gratia payments for those people who aren't getting the amount in their certificate of order. And what we've seen, whenever that order hasn't been paid, it's usually several times more than that ex gratia payment. So they might get, say, $2,000, and what they're owed is between $10,000 and $20,000. So that's not good enough. It's something, but people come to us and say, why am I accepting this $2,000 when I should have been getting $12,000, $15,000? So there's a real problem here with salary non-payments. It almost seems to be a business model of some of these small subcontractors and construction companies, that they bring their workers on. What we see when we see people with salary claims is people who've worked for maybe 6 months before they lodge a salary claim, because if they make a complaint at the start, they're sure that they will finish their job. If they make it after, say, 6 months, they might get the money they're owed, and it would be more money in hand. But we find very, very poor results from the outcome of salary claims. But let me just talk specifics here. Besides those two things of electronic payments and salary slips, we might think about minimum salary, which is what several other countries that we can be compared to, not just Western countries. So I think it's Japan, South Korea, Hong Kong, they have minimum pay, salaries. So that's one thing. The other is job mobility. If this job isn't working out, make it certain that you can get a new job. And how to prevent those kickbacks or those kickbacks. If it happens in Singapore, it can be controlled. If they go back to home country, it's very hard to control how much money is paid to various middlemen to get that job. But most of the people we know who are given permission to switch companies, they say, I couldn't afford it. I didn't get my salary. I wasn't paid my salary. I only got this small ex gratia payment. I've been given permission to find a new company, but it's more than I can afford. So if it happens in Singapore, deal with it. Get some real enforcement. Enforcement about the certificate of order after the salary claim is concluded, and enforcement of whoever is asking for money for that new employment. So those are things. And the other thing, if there were easier job mobility in Singapore, for people who are within Singapore, it would also help to cut the agent fees that are asked for when people are coming from abroad. So it would be a way towards that, from breaking small companies from their addiction to the kickbacks that they receive from their workers.
Thank you. There are some questions coming through about mental health, and I imagine that if anything, solving the payments problem would contribute greatly to mental health. But if you had some comments about that aspect, too, feel free to contribute them here. Who's next?
If you don't mind, could I go?
Please do.
Okay. So I think with regards to like the policy changes, the lower hanging fruits as well that I see with the drive for empathy is also looking at the more human aspects of workers' lives while they're in Singapore, in terms of the social spaces or in terms of the rights to kind of organize. It reminds me of early clans and associations in Singapore that were mutual self-help groups for early migrant workers. And I think what was interesting about the strength of clans and associations gathering was also in how they supported one another. New migrants as they came were supported, whether financially or with regards to housing or even welfare, when they are not doing very well in terms of job insecurity, or if they are having a rough time at work, or even with their families back home. And I think the nature of humans is that we are social creatures. Looking at migrant workers in Singapore, I think the access and ability to socialize is mostly limited also by how much they can afford, and also the spaces where they are seated in terms of the places where they can go. So I think the organizing and the kind of gathering approach on a social manner could also be something that was looked into, which is why for us in our work with Singapore Migrant Friends, it's also through the means of sports and arts and activities to bring people together, learn new skills, and participate in social activities that is contributing to the overall well-being of a person away from home. I think especially in this time of uncertainty, there is strength in self-supporting one another, whether people who speak the same languages from the same countries and even villages, how they have came together to support and rally one another. We had a couple of workers in Singapore Migrant Friends who were actually in S11, the dormitory, with a lot of infections. And in the initial phases, we were all very concerned for their well-being. And I think that support network that we had really helped the two workers like overcome their anxiety. So there is value in that supporting. And I think the other policy change could also be considering ethical hiring guidelines for private sector, and also for in terms of the enforcement of agent fees. It is a very host country issue of having high agent fees, but I think across ASEAN networks or cross-country bilateral agreements may also be helpful in solidifying some guidelines or baselines of how much agents' fees should be paid. So these could be possibilities that would be looked at. And I think in the private sector, there are also a lot of solutions that are coming up. I think to consider these solutions seriously, and also to relook at how we've been hiring and also been providing for certain elements at work. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So before we go on to the to Michael, there is also a question here pointing to the longer term aspect that we should keep our eye on about the strategy to reduce our economic and I guess social dependency on migrant workers. I wonder what migrant workers would feel about that, and what do you feel about that as well? So feel free to slip that into Michael.
Okay. Thanks, Kenneth. So maybe I'll touch on the part where you say whether the salary and the mental health and whether they're all intertwined and interrelated. So the short to the of that is definitely yes. However, we are, the workers that we engage with, they are very resilient people. They've gone through a lot of things, they've sacrificed a lot of things just to be here. And I think most of them at points, breaking point is during when they are not able to provide for family back home. So that's always an issue. Being distant from family is also another issue. So when we look at it holistically, salary is definitely a triggering point. Being far from family is another issue that they also have to face, loneliness, and yet needing to deal with the stress of work, stress of life, and things like that. And how do we want to deal with this, right? So one of the low-hanging fruits that you're asking about is, we do want to be able to offer, and maybe counselors alike and everyone. It's not just to to maybe open the channels to migrant workers as well, not necessarily just for local Singaporeans. That's one. Enabling them to see that it's okay. It's okay to go through these stresses. It's okay to be afraid, and you have avenues to be able to talk about it, to be able to see whether or not maybe some financial assistance or even some strategy. We never talk about financial strategy with them before. It would be a good thing to start some conversations like that with them. One of the key things that we in HealthServe we always try to advocate for is that every worker that comes, and when they get injured, especially, they struggle to just get treatment. For one, because I think it is, example, if you were to go to a hospital, they will need some form of a letter of guarantee just from an employer, so to be able to get admitted to the hospital. And that's the reason, because of that, currently all employers are responsible for the health of the migrant workers, and that's rightly so. However, we have also come to realize that during this pandemic, it has shown some weakness in that. I know of very many good employers. They're actually coming to me and say that, it's very hard. It's very, very hard. I'm trying to just keep my business afloat, let alone taking care of the worker. And it's not that I don't want to, it's sometimes really not possible. And so if we can, in mid to longer term, perhaps if we can look into the policy of just allowing the worker to have some form of access to our medical care, especially when they're injured, for continuity of care. Because without that, they will not be able to get their assessment done properly, and that kind of delay the whole process of the assessment in the first place. So that's something which I'm thinking that, if possible, this is a policy that is good to look into. And in your question of whether or not, in future, should we be fully dependent on migrant workers and sorts, and how do they relate to this whole thing? Personally, I'm no expert in this whole field in terms of the economics of it, but I would say that the migrant worker comes here for a very, very valid reason. They have a dream. They want to work hard to be able to just provide for family. they have very good dreams. They want to be successful in life, and who doesn't? It's very similar to any Singaporeans who does that as well. So is it a fault of theirs to just come and find place to be able to, and to be able to contribute, to be able to earn, to be able to provide? I think that's probably how I'll angle it more towards, rather than whether it's going to be economic benefit again to not have them or to have them. And lastly, regarding the question of what are the things that I hope we can do, I'm not sure if you're aware, migrant worker NGOs are always considered as like the margin side. We are not the mainstream NGOs. And one of the things that I do hope that post-COVID or even right now, that the migrant worker NGOs, the work that we do today, and the NGOs here that represents can be considered mainstream. And migrant worker population do make up 1/5 of the population in Singapore. It's quite a large group. So so that's something probably I would love to see happen.
And I so want to jump in, Michael, now. Can I?
Sure.
Please do.
So we do raise uncomfortable truths even in peacetime, but we all are kind of bound by our love and our passion to change status quo, and that requires some kind of uncomfortable discussions, such as the ones that we are having now, and we're hoping that we'll have more of. And I just wanted to add that since we're on the topic of, what are the low-hanging fruits, there are a few things that we've done in the pandemic, which I hope can continue. And one thing, like Michael said, was access to healthcare. So workers now had access to the PHPC, for outpatient care and those are not something that they generally have, and that is something that you can continue. Electronic salaries, you suddenly have more bank accounts being opened. That is something again that you should continue. There's a lot of discussion about well-being, which is great. If that's being discussed by the agency, and these are generally not. We see advisories, but we've not seen so much dedicated space on well-being, and so that is good. An interagency task force. Well-being is a very complex issue. It's not just about their working conditions. And so we've seen this task force that has come up. We've seen, maybe we should complain that home is not part of that, but there is some semblance of coordination and getting the civil society engaged. And I hope that continues. We have, as Bernard mentioned, Debbie mentioned, we all engage behind the scenes. We do also joint advocacy whenever we feel that the sum of the parts is more than our it's more valuable whenever on issue based. But I think that this can be more institutionalized. So it's not just about whether the civil society is collaborating, but we also have access to a team which is interagency, which is not just the MOM. And I think that also requires, that's a difficult discussion. That's a more longer term discussion. It requires us to look deep down on our migrant worker policies, which are mainly premised around maintaining Singapore's competitiveness, right? It's keeping our costs low. It's still employer centric. And so that's at the heart of all issues. And I think it's time to kind of question that. And I think this is a great opportunity to shake up things. If we look at this issue and we just look at our dorms and let's do some electronic payment, I think we've missed out on a real opportunity here. And I think how we emerge out, it's a great opportunity to also expand Singapore's soft power, to go beyond this business friendly image, to look at our migrant worker population. And there is so many things that we've discussed. There is need for interagency coordination. There's the role of NGOs, the power dynamics between employers, and it has emerged more starkly in a crisis. These are all issues that were anyways there, but how do we address this gap between policy and practice? So there are also enforcement issues. Home has long advocated for worker union, giving workers a voice. I don't know if that's very palatable, but we could look at other mechanisms maybe. And
that's not a low-hanging fruit, right?
That's not a low-hanging fruit at all. That's very high-hanging. But maybe mechanisms like ombudsman, to look at redressal and justice, and maybe we should be having those discussions as well in the longer term.
Okay, just 10 seconds, Bernard. 10 seconds.
Okay, so I just wanted to end off with what you talked about, longer term change and whether or not continued reliance on such a large pool of low wage, low skill migrant workers. How do we wean ourselves off that? In a way, we've all talked about in different forums, people have been saying Singapore's kind of addicted to low wage, low skill migrant workers, carrying the bulk of the heavy lifting on the ground. And actually, I think, I quite agree with that. What we found, which touches on a lot of things, and some of the things Debbie's already mentioned on, fees and things like that, is that there tends to be a little bit of a correlation there. Generally, the lower the skill, the higher the recruitment fee to pay. If you look at it in terms of a bit like a market type setting, if you are a low skill, low wage migrant worker, the lower down the skills ladder that you are, you would expect to pay a lot more money in order to secure a job to come to Singapore. And Debbie's pointed it out. All these payments are made to because you need more middlemen to be involved to help you source for this job because of how far you are away from the recruitment center and how low your skills are. But if we could try and reconfigure the way we do a migrant worker recruitment, and this is just an idea that we having for a long time now, and try and shift away from hiring for quantity at this level, but instead hire for quality. Because what we find is the higher the skill, the more the worker or the candidate is able to determine his own terms of the contract, rather than left with no choice at all and just have to accept whatever to get. And the other thing is, generally most higher skilled workers have better English competencies. They're better able to integrate into the Singaporean society and system. They tend to not have a lower tolerance for workplace malpractices, like, for example, salaries not coming because they have greater mobility. So, at the same time, this would go alongside the productivity effort, the greater productivity effort among industry in Singapore. And I think there's a lot of benefit. So I just want to leave everybody with this thought. Maybe that's the way we could go. And in the process of doing that, maybe lower our reliance on low skill, low wage migrant workers, and obviously many knock-on challenges and issues that come with a large population like that. I wonder if people might give some thought to that and see how. Obviously, in order to get that done, like you're saying, it's not short or medium term. You've got to get everybody in on the act. Industry, corporates, and companies have got to cooperate. The government have got to see that there's value in this. We will obviously try and champion ground up, and Singaporeans have got to come in and, of course, give their opinions as well. So I think at the end of the day, we just go back to this whole of society approach again. I just want to leave everybody with an idea like that.
I think that's really an excellent thought to end on. Even though I'm very certain that the panel will have many other things that they would want to talk about, and certainly there are many excellent questions that have come through the system throughout that unfortunately we've not been able to address adequately, because that's all the time that we actually have. We've gone past the time actually. So very grateful for this opportunity. I mean, I am very grateful for this opportunity to be so illuminated by all your presentations. They're very sincere. They're very honest. They're very truthful and constructive, very inspiring, in fact. So thank you for that. Thank you also to the audience for spending this time with us and for contributing so actively on our Q&A board. I'm sure we'll have many more conversations about this and aim towards some of these, picking some of the low fruit, but also the loftier ideas that are well worth thinking about. So thank you. I am asked to mention that there is a feedback form that we would like you to fill, and that would be very helpful to us as we presumably plan for future events like like this. So that's thank you from me, and maybe we can each say goodbye and sign off. Thank you, panel.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
everyone.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kenneth.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.